Vaccines are the key in bringing an end to the COVID-19 pandemic, and multiple research efforts have brought many options and types, from the newer mRNA vaccines by Moderna and Pfizer, and recently approved protein-based vaccine from Novavax. While mRNA vaccines have been rolling out since last year, Novavax is in the spotlight for being the first protein-based vaccine to be licensed, despite the fact that protein-based vaccines have been in use since decades ago. So, will protein-based vaccines be able to outperform their mRNA counterparts? Let's start off with the basics. How do vaccines provide immunity? When you get an infection, your white blood cells detect the pathogens such as viruses or bacteria by binding to a part of the pathogen that's called an antigen. These antigens are used to distinguish body cells from foreign cells such as bacteria or viruses. In the case of COVID, the antigen is the spike protein. When the white blood cell recognizes a cell as a pathogen, an immune response is initiated. Towards the end of it, many copies of a type of white blood cell called plasma cells produce substances called antibodies. These antibodies bind to the antigen of the pathogen, which can restrict its movement, neutralize it, or disable it from infecting cells, and mark it for destruction by other white blood cells. In the process, a different type of white blood cell called memory cells are made, and they stay in the body long after the infection subsides. When the same pathogen infects the body again, the memory cells that recognize it will differentiate rapidly into many plasma cells and launch a quicker immune response than the first infection, eliminating the threat before you get sick. Vaccines trick the body into thinking it's being infected so that an immune response will be initiated and that memory cells are produced. Traditional vaccines introduce inactivated or weakened pathogen. mRNA vaccines inject you with the pathogen's mRNA, which your own body cells use to produce the pathogen's antigen. And protein-based vaccines introduce the antigen of the pathogen or part of it directly into your blood, which will trigger an immune response when a white blood cell binds to it. So, how are the antigens for protein-based vaccines mass-produced? The process makes use of genetic engineering and recombinant DNA in a way similar to how insulin is artificially produced. The DNA that encodes for the spike protein in SARS-CoV-2 is extracted from the virus and inserted into DNA of other organisms such as bacteria, yeast, or even insect cells, such as the case of Novavax, to form the recombinant DNA. The organism is allowed to multiply so that there will be many cells containing the recombinant DNA. When supplied with the necessary substances, these cells will use the recombinant DNA as a blueprint and produce the spike proteins. The spike proteins are then extracted and purified and added with substances such as preservatives and adjuvants, which helps boost the immune response. Protein-based vaccines have been in use for a long time. The first protein-based vaccine for hepatitis B was licensed in the US in 1986. Compared to mRNA vaccines, which were first authorized in 2020, specifically for COVID, we can expect protein-based vaccines to be more trusted due to its longer history. A principal reason why protein-based vaccines are wanted is because of its lower production cost. This means that it can be mass-produced in lower-income countries and COVID vaccination targets can be reached faster. The overall transportation process is also simpler as its storing temperature ranges from 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, higher than other vaccines like Pfizer, which should be stored at -80 to -60 degrees Celsius. Although there are slight differences between the many types of vaccines, in the end, they all achieve the goal of immunity in one way or another. This immunity does not protect you from getting infected, but instead serves to initiate a fast enough immunity response so that you don't get critically sick. This also reduces the time for the virus to be eliminated, which lowers the risk of you transmitting it to another person. However, since the nature of vaccination and the immune response is heavily dependent on the antigen of the virus, getting vaccinated may not necessarily give you immunity to all variants of COVID-19, since each variant may have slight differences in antigens. Because of this, even though you are fully vaccinated, you should still take the necessary precautions.